When I was first thinking about writing this speech, my first thought was back to when I arrived here 4 years ago. I was reminded of my flight from the West Coast to Boston, and reminded of how I felt on that flight. And it wasn't great. I was pretty nervous, I was anxious and scared. I actually cried on the flight, but looking back on that, I think I feel worse for the man sitting next to me, who clearly did not know what to do. So also, if you thought sitting next to Polly was bad. But what was I so nervous about? I wasn't nervous about flying. I wasn't nervous about moving to a new place. I wasn't nervous about leaving my family or starting a new school. I was nervous that I wasn't cut out for college. I was scared that I would fail and have to move back to BC and in with my parents. But obviously, I made it. We all did, actually. And I didn't have to turn around and go home. I didn't have to move back to BC or back in with my parents, yet. But that doesn't mean I didn't fail. I've actually experienced quite a lot of failures since I've been here. And maybe today, graduation actually represents a culmination of those failures. Failure was something that I was really afraid of growing up as a kid. I was embarrassed. I had a thing to avoid at all costs. The fear of failing prevented me from taking a shot on goal when I played soccer in elementary school. The possibility of being wrong prevented me from speaking up in class. The idea of getting a poor grade prevented me from trying new courses that I had little background in. But over the last few years, particularly during my time here at COA, I've learned to reframe that failure, to take a different perspective on it, to see failure as a stepping stone rather than an obstacle. And although this process didn't happen overnight, there are several moments that I keep coming back to. There was my first year here as an RA. That was quite the experience for everyone involved. I remember the first time I had to have a difficult conversation with a resident about a conflict in the house. And although I can't tell you what that conflict is about, I can assure you one thing: neither of us felt any better by the end of that conversation. To this day, I can still feel all of my awkwardness and discomfort. I can still hear myself stumbling over my words, still remember trying so hard to maintain eye contact, despite wanting nothing more than to look away. And when that conversation was over, I just sat for a moment, and I envisioned that going so differently in my head. What a failure. But I learned from that, and the next conversations went a little better, just a little. And the next ones after that, even smoother. Looking back at that today, I'd be tempted to say that I should have known those conversations weren't going to be perfect. But that's not being fair to myself. How could I have known? And what do I know now that's different? Well, the difference between then and now is failure. One of my more recent but equally impressive failures was during my internship this summer. I was fortunate enough to intern at the Australian Regenerative Medicine Institute in Melbourne. And I say I was fortunate because upon my arrival, I realized very quickly that I was significantly underqualified for the job. My summer involved a series of botched experiments and muddled results, which I'm very sorry about, Nadia. There was one day in particular that stood out to me. It was quite a long day, and so naturally, I found a plethora of creative ways to screw up the experiment. So many, in fact, that they canceled each other out. And it was a bit like in math, where two negatives make a positive. And they named that phenomenon after me in the lab, but it's not very polite, so we won't go there. That internship helped me realize that failure in science is inevitable. In some ways, it's a cornerstone of the scientific method. It's a critical part of the process. Our classic image of the scientist dressed in a lab coat shouting "Eureka" is inaccurate. The reality involves a lot more profanity and a lot fewer eurekas. Scientists are used to failing, and all scientific accomplishments are based on a long series of failures. In fact, we're suspicious when science is too successful. My failures in the lab were not only normal, but necessary. How else was I supposed to know what would be successful if I hadn't yet discovered what would be wildly unsuccessful? One thing that I've learned from these failures and mistakes is that I will always constantly be failing at something. We all will. Failure is not only inevitable, but it's ongoing. It's a critical part of the process of learning. And if you want to push and challenge yourself, there's no way to avoid it. My last 4 years here have taught me to embrace this, to embrace my failures, to learn from them, to count on them to help to move me forward, to do what I like to call failing well. I think it's pretty safe to say that all of us graduating today are feeling some degree of uncertainty or nervousness about what is to come in the next couple of days, weeks, or months. What will life after COA look like? Although some of us know what we'll be doing, Yuka, Takamon, I'm looking at you, many of us don't, and that might make us nervous. Perhaps some of you think that I'm here to ease that anxiety, and if so, I have some bad news. Some of that uncertainty and nervousness is actually well-founded. If the past is any indication of the future, is that once we graduate, we can expect some amount of failure. A lot. A torrential downpour. Biblical-style plague of frogs failure. Maybe we'll struggle to find a job, although surely not with a degree in human ecology. Maybe we won't get into the grad school we wanted on our first try. Maybe we won't get the scholarship we needed. Maybe we'll let down a friend, or let down ourselves. But don't let that fear of possible failure limit you. Don't let it stop you from applying to your dream job, or your dream school, or since this is COA, more likely your dream farm. The word failure actually comes from the old French word faillir, meaning to fail to do something. Not to fail at something, but to fail to do it in the first place. Perhaps this is the kind of failure that we should be wary of. So if you haven't failed yet, I would venture to say that you aren't trying hard enough. If you limit yourself to what you know you're good at, to what you're comfortable with, to the safe zone, you might never fail. But you might also never succeed. So to remember to think of those failures as stepping stones. You'll need them to continue to move forward. In fact, our fear of failure is often the only thing holding us back. If you're worried about taking the risk, worried about failing, ask yourself, would you rather settle with mediocre success or spectacular failure? Personally, I would go with the latter. Thank you.